All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Appreciate everybody being here tonight and those that are watching online as well. We have officially finished Romans, and so we read for the last time from Romans on Tuesday, and we are transitioning today into the Gospel of Luke, and we will spend time in Luke's writings over the next couple of months, going through Luke and then Acts back to back, and so I hope you look forward to that. Tonight is, if you want to, go ahead and turn in your Bible, Romans 12. We're going to be in Romans 12 to 16. In the first two sections that we covered, the first 2 weeks of our study, I brought up the fact that, Romans is a tough book. There's just a lot of depth to it. There's a lot of things that as you read it, you say, man, I'm not sure what he means here. That's the first two sections. They're just tough. The last section is tough, but in a different way. It's not tough to understand, it's tough to do. It's tough to figure out what it looks like and how you can do that, and how we figure out some of the specifics. The big ideas he makes pretty clear to us, and so it's a different challenge for us in looking at these last 5 chapters together. I want to give just a real quick again, bring us back to where we're at in the book, and then we'll kind of go through the flow of this last section and get into some questions and some specifics. But remember, in the opening chapters that we looked at in Romans, you've got this huge idea, right, that sin is everywhere, right? Jew, Gentile alike are mired, stuck in sin, and there's no hope in that situation except for through faith in Christ. And we see in the first 3 chapters that lostness of the world, and by chapter 3, partway through that into chapter 4, you have the faith in Jesus, right, as exemplified in people like Abraham, that kind of faith, right? Not faith through works of the law, but faith that allows him to be, faith that allows him to be righteous, not through works of the law, but through the kind of faith that he had. And you see that kind of flow into chapter 5, where it's not about us, right? It's not about we were righteous before God and he came to us, but while we were still in sin, he came. And so he says, now that you have had that happen, that you have been made something new, live a new way. Don't continue in the old way. And that flows all the way through chapter 8 with the good news about Jesus. Then we saw, for the last part of our study last week, 9 through 11, right? Well, what about the Jewish people? What is God going to do in their situation? Are they going to be saved? Are they going to have the promises fulfilled? And the answer is yes, but not as maybe they anticipated. And so that leads us into chapter 12. Through chapter 16. And again, this is a part of the book of Romans that all of it's, practical, if you will, but this is more of the nuts and bolts of living out your faith. And so in chapter 12, he mentions this at the very beginning. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so he lays out, this is what you must be, right? You must be a transformed, changed people. And then we see really in the next 4 chapters, this is that transformation that you ought to see within you. And so we see how it takes place within the body and how we do our part serving as we have been given a gift to do. Then in the rest of chapter 12, we see how we interact together, how we interact with the world, how we interact with God, all of these things going on. And in the very end of chapter 12, he gets to the idea of revenge and not taking vengeance on our part, but allowing God to handle that. And he tells us in chapter 13, then one of the ways he handles it, which is through the government. The government exists to kind of keep things working the way that God wants, though, again, doesn't always do it the way that it should. But the point is, we as Christians follow the rules. We go along with the government because God has put it in place. And then he starts to almost go backwards a little bit. Through the end of chapter 13, he goes back to the idea of loving one another, and he goes back to the idea of being transformed by the end of chapter 13, and tells us to put on the armor of light and to live not in darkness, but in the way of light. And at the very end of chapter 13, he says to not engage in certain things, including quarreling and jealousy. And then he says, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. And then in chapters 14 and 15, he walks us through one of those struggles, right, regarding our flesh and our desires and quarreling and jealousy. And that's when we disagree about opinion things, things that are not things we have to agree upon. When we fight over those, that's when this quarreling and jealousy occurs. And so he gives us a mindset to bring to it, which is ultimately do what is best for others. Be like Jesus is kind of how he concludes that in chapter 15. And then it ends with a call to remember the fact that God has planned the Jewish and Gentile people to be a part of his kingdom, and he highlights that with all of these texts related to the Gentiles. And then he basically wraps up with a summary of his ministry. His ministry is to those Gentiles, and the reason why he's not ever been to Rome is because he's been going all over preaching to those groups of people who need to hear about Jesus, but he's out of places to go, which is kind of crazy if you read that and you thought, man, that's kind of crazy. He says, I've got nowhere else to preach, so I got to go somewhere further away, and so I'm going to go to Spain, and I'm going to go to Spain through Rome. And so he wants to see the congregation in Rome, and then he tells them, but I've got somewhere to go first. I have to go to Jerusalem. And if it matches up with what my understanding is, Neil Pollard brought this up in the commentary, but if it matches up right, he was taking that to Jerusalem. We see that near the end of the book of Acts, and that's when he's arrested, so things don't go very well. He ends up going to Rome, though not as anticipated. Instead of being free, he's in prison at that point. And then he ends with some greetings to some different people. N.T. Wright, in his commentary, kind of looked at this, and he saw 5 what we would call house churches, is what he kind of drew the distinction as. Whether or not that's accurate, just seeing within the different groups that Paul writes to here. And then he has one more section of a kind of a final appeal about things. And so, as we've kind of done, that is my very, very, very fast summary of the section that we went through over the last week. What we're going to do is dig into this a little bit more. And again, much like we're going to see this with every single study we do, we normally barely get through a chapter a week if we study a book, and we're trying to do 5 in one night. So obviously we're not going to get to everything. But I want you to go back to chapter 12. And I want you to look at those first couple of verses again. And I want to notice particularly verse 2. He says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And so this idea of not being conformed to the world, but being transformed, N.T. Wright called this the idea of being countercultural, right? Being different, being distinct. Now, when we think about that, one of the things that he highlighted is we are to be countercultural, but not in every way, right? There are times where culture sort of gets things right. There are times where we can even line up with things that culture says, this is good, right? We need to, when there's a natural disaster and people are rallying in a community, right, to help people, that's good. There's nothing wrong with that because culture's doing it. No, can't help people because culture's doing that, right? That's not the kind of countercultural we're called to be, but there are times where we are supposed to be different. And that's where it gets a little more challenging, right? We love when we can do what culture's doing and it lines up with God and it works really well. We don't enjoy it quite as much when our being countercultural draws negative attention. And yet when you look at all of the things that we see in chapter 12, we would say, these are all good things, but they're not normal things. This is not what everyone does. And so the challenge for us is, as we read all of this, to say, okay, kind of put to the side, what does culture do? And say, what exactly has God called us to do? And am I going to stand out for that? Probably. Is it going to look a little odd sometimes? Yeah. But this is the way of life. And so I want to just ask, when you look at verses 3 all the way through the end of chapter 12, what are the things that jump out to you as distinctly countercultural that we're called to do as Christians? All right, chapter 12, 3 through 20 deals with all, or 21 deals with all of these different things, how we work in the body, how we engage with one another, how we deal with God, how we deal with people in the world. What jumps out to you in this section, Sheila?
Chapter 17, repay no one evil for evil.
That's easier said than done, right? But that is countercultural. That's not the norm. And in many ways, our culture might even say that's not just. That's not what should happen, right? You let evil go, but that's exactly what God says to do. Dave?
Before we get into specific,
Yep.
I was thinking, this is really the challenge of the world, humanistic worldview versus the biblical worldview. And so much of our problems in our culture is coming because they come from a humanistic viewpoint, and whether it be the abortion issues and how you treat human beings and racism. And so that is really the heart of our differences, is how we view things through God's lenses of God's word, how he created man, versus the humanistic viewpoint, which really has no value to human beings. And so that's where a lot of this, I think, really comes to a shed mark.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a kind of a good distinction there. Part of it is our actions are going to be different. But another aspect to it is the solutions that we see for the identical problems the world sees are also going to be different, right? The motivation for those things, the reason we see this is how we ought to behave or how we ought to live is going to differ from the world. And at times, though we may look like we're doing the same thing, it's for very different reasons, and that will eventually, you'll see that, right? That comes out in the way that we live and the way that we talk, and that's going to become known. Go ahead, Rudy. Right.
You know, but he's telling us, you know, if you already changed, you might as well stay in the path you're going for, instead of going back and try to do things for the world.
Yeah, there's a different perspective we approach life with, right? We come to life with a different attitude, a different focus, a different mindset, a different spirit, and that's supposed to be seen in the way that we live. It's not just some kind of a figurative idea, but it's meant to actually be lived out. Jim? Yeah, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. I mean, to say good, to pray for, to say anything positively, or to encourage in some way, or to not just totally go against people who persecute, that doesn't make any sense. And yet he calls us to do this. I want you to go back, look at the first little section here. He talks about the way we approach really who we are. Right? So much of who we are as individual people, and this goes to Dave's thought about the humanistic mindset of the world is, right, you be the best you that you can be. You be important. It doesn't matter what people say about you. It's your view of yourself is the only thing that matters, and you need to think of yourself as the most important person in your life. And so other people, they can get pushed aside because you matter most. You take care of yourself. And yet here, when you look at what he calls us to do within the body, he says very clearly, verse 3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think," which again, that goes, we would say in culture, right? Think hugely of yourself, right? You tell yourself just how important you are. And he says, don't focus in on being important. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And so we see talents and gifts and abilities, and these kind of connect with 1 Corinthians 12, a similar idea, but these are less of the miraculous kind of things that we tend to think about with 1 Corinthians. But it's all of that is not meant for us to say, look at how amazing I am and how useful I am. It's all meant to actually further the church's mission and God's mission, which is a whole different mindset, right? There's no climbing a ladder. There's no trying to push others aside so I can have an elevated place. That's not important in any way in the kingdom. Go ahead, Mike.
That kind of puts a stake in the heart of today's postmodern view, which is there is no ultimate truth. There's my truth. You have your truth, and that person has that person's truth. It's not about you.
Right.
Bring it back that there is no ultimate truth.
Yeah, there is something, right, that we are called to be, and we're on a mission, and it's not our mission in the sense of we get to dictate everything, right? It's God's mission, and we're a part of that process. And so he lays out the attitude that we're called to have there in those verses. And then you get to that verses 9 through 21, and you see all of these different attitudes, right? The way we're to treat one another. I love verse 10. I don't know what your translation says, but the ESV reads, outdo one another in showing honor. Now, I love the idea of, almost a competition of sorts, right? In choosing to elevate each other in such a way that everyone is being elevated because everybody is seeking to elevate everyone else and to bless everyone else and to do those kinds of things. And then to kind of what you guys have brought up in that last section, 14 through 21, you have these challenges over and over again, right? Live at peace. Don't repay evil for evil. Live in harmony. Don't take vengeance, right? And all of that, God is really just saying, trust me. Right? He's saying, bless those who persecute you. Don't get even with people. Don't seek vengeance. Well, why? Trust that God's going to take care of things, right? And he says, basically, the reason that we ought to live in that way is the very verse 21. The attitude is, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. He seems to be saying, when you respond in kind, what have you done? You have been overcome by evil. And you have allowed that evil to come out of you. But when we do it God's way, we've actually overcome evil with good. And so he lays out for us this way we're to approach each other and even the world and those that may have issues with us or struggles with us is this is how we live. This is what we do. This is how we behave. Any other thoughts on that opening chapter 12? Go ahead, Michael.
I guess verse 20 is basically saying about how we should love our enemies.
Right.
And that's different from what the world generally sees how we ought to respond to people who we determine are our enemies. But also, I think it's important for us to see how that as Christians we have a true devotion to God, which it displays itself in two things here. He talks about prayer and then the way in which we love one another with a brotherly love, a love of an agape love, not the kind of love that man manufactures or determines to show itself by his own thoughts, how love it is, but
Sure.
more what 1 Corinthians says, and a godly love, and the world doesn't do that.
Yeah, this is God's way of living versus the way the world chooses to live, and God's way of loving, and God's way of His people interacting together. And it's not easy, right? It's not easy to do this. And even the things in that first section of the call, how we treat each other, 9 through 13, it's not easy to do a lot of this, but it's what we do. It is who we are. As the people of God. And so he gives us, again, you go back to verses 1 and 2 of the chapter, right? This is the transformed, changed life that we bring because of Jesus. Go ahead, Brianna.
I think another reason, like with the bless those that persecute you, is also thinking about their eternal soul. Because while they are doing evil, it could be, they just don't know the word. And if you pray about them, you're praying about their eternal soul. And you're thinking not just of your own current circumstances and how they are treating you, but also their eternal circumstance. And it also helps us put into perspective that, like what you're saying, to just trust in the Lord that He will take care of it, is, if they are hurting us, if we do decide to pray to bless them, if they don't have earthly consequences for their actions, they're going to have an eternity of actions if they don't repent. And I think that's just a good reminder for us that the Lord does have it. Even if right now this feels like our world, this feels like everything, it's not everything. Our lives are just like a blip in everything that the Lord knows. So it's just a good reminder.
Yeah, I think it's the way that we approach the Christian walk, right, is we view life differently. And it's not just the way we treat people, but it's in line with the fact that eternity exists. And because eternity exists, we have to view things differently, right? If we knew we only had so many years and that was truly it, well, then you would live differently. I mean, that's even if you say, I don't believe in God anymore. Well, even if you got to the point where you don't believe in God, if you knew how much time you had, you would live differently than otherwise, right? We kind of live as if we've got plenty of time. But we only have a set amount of time. But we see here, we understand that set amount of time is just a small part of eternity. And so everything really does matter in the way we treat people, the way we engage in those things. Mike?
I want to focus in on verse 2, where it says, don't be transformed by the renewal of your mind by testing to discern what is the will of God. We are not called to have blind faith. We are told to use our mind to test, to discern. Belief is a logical process. If it was a blind faith that a lot of people accuse us of having, and frankly some people with greater Christianity, sometimes they do have blind faith. But blind faith is a work of me. If I'm taking a leap of faith, I'm the one who's done something. That's not what God has done. God has spilled it all out there for us, shown us time and time again, given us all the evidence we need. We don't need to take any blind leaps of faith. All we have to do is follow what He's already set forth for us, and that's why we live the transformed life that He's known.
Yeah, you look at the wording there, right? And he says, and basically it's as if God is saying, listen, test me. Test what you think I'm telling you. Test what you think you're supposed to do, because He wants us to. It's not just, like you said, it's not just, well, put on the blinders, don't look, just roll with it, and figure it out. No, it's you be a changed people, and then by testing, you can discern exactly what I want you to do. Go ahead, Dave.
You know, I think the Greek word that transform is the metamorphi, where we talk about the metamorphosis of a caterpillar moving into a butterfly. And you think about that, that's a total transformation from caterpillar to butterfly, metamorphosis. And yet, you know, too many times we take Christianity, we kind of dabble in it, it's kind of half-hearted, lukewarm, and yet he calls us to be both feet in it. I mean, let's go into the deep, and let's go for it.
Yeah, and again, you look at what we see here in my translation. When they put the little headings in there in chapter 12, starting in verse 9, it says marks of the true Christian. I don't know why they chose exactly that, but the idea is that you can't do this and be partly committed to it. I mean, if you're going to do this, it's because you truly believe this stuff, and it's the way that you're going to live. And that leads us into chapter 13, which places an even more challenging aspect on our lives. And this is one of those areas where you're going to read it and say, but what about, and what about this, and what about that? We have all of these questions, right? Because he says, well, you got to just obey the government, right? The government's been put in place by God, and it leads us to a lot of questions, right? Well, what about bad leadership? And what about when governments do this and governments do that? And those are legitimate questions. We should ask those things. And again, as Mike brought up, God doesn't just say, hey, just ignore everything going on in the world and don't ever ask questions. No, think about it, right? What does this all mean? But the point that he's making here is, once again, going back to the previous section, part of this is let the government handle vengeance, the punishment. All that's their responsibility. You do the right things. You live in line with the way that you're called to do. You pay taxes. You pay respect. You do all of those things. You let them do what they're supposed to do. And then even with that, when they don't do it right, who are they still accountable to? They're still accountable to God, right? And so we still have that trust level in God of even when things don't make sense. Think, why in the world is God doing this? Well, God's used a lot of different places and people and situations for his purposes, and we have to trust him with, again, going back to what Mike said, not with a blind faith, but with understanding God's done this before. He's used Rome, and he's used Babylon, and he's used Syria, and these places that we would say, well, how does God have anything to do with that? Well, he's using them for a purpose. And so that, it doesn't always answer every specific question, but it does help us, I think, kind of grasp a little bit about what God is doing. Go ahead, Rudy, and then Dave.
And I'm just going to add to that, as they were saying, try to live at peace with the world, whatever you can. I mean, it's for your own good, actually,
Right.
The thing that I like about how the scriptures tells us is how to live a good life, actually.
Right.
If we don't do that, we're going to be at war all the time, or we're going to have problems all the time. So
Yeah.
basically, it's for our own benefits as we live here, until we are called to go to heaven.
Yeah, the more you study what God has called us to be, right, it's good for us. It is beneficial for us. And you look at this section where he says, basically, live in line with the law. Be good citizens in that regard. It makes sense, really, in a lot of ways, that if we're going to be persecuted, which he's already brought up in the last chapter, right? If we're going to be attacked, if we're going to have any negative things against us, it ought to be not because we're doing things that are deserving of negative things, but because of God, right? And so if we're rebellious and we're constantly overthrowing every government and we're always, well, that's going to lead to problems, but it's not because we're Christians. It's because we don't like a ruler, right? We don't like being governed. But here we see, well, no, you do what you're supposed to do. If you're persecuted, okay, right? God's aware of that. But we're not going to bring negative things to the church, to Christ, because of our poor behavior, but because we're actually doing what he's told us to do. Go ahead, Dave.
I think in Acts chapter 4 and 17, where the authority said, don't speak any longer in his name, and then Peter and John said in verse 19, judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. So, really it comes down to sometimes it's not so much, if they're not asking us to do something that's against the faith and against the conscience, well then, guess what? That should be less of an issue to fight against.
Right, and again, it's really easy. I mean, we've lived the last a year and a half now, where it's just everything is chaos, and there's all kinds of struggle with what they're saying and what this is saying, and the government's this and the government's that. It's easy to say it when we really like everything that's happening. It's a lot harder to say that when we don't necessarily like some of the things that are going on. But again, to the point, right? We do what God has called us to do, and what Dave brought up there. There are times where the government might say, "Well, you can't do X, Y, or Z," and it's, "Well, no, God has called me to do whatever that is, and I'm going to do it anyway." But that's not everything. And so again, in the areas where we can, we do, and when we can't, then we don't. It's ultimately doing what God has called us to do. All right, go to verse 8. I love this next section. So he's just finished talking about pay taxes, pay revenue, pay honor, respect. And then he says, owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And then he says, all of these things, right? Don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't murder, right? This is all summed up with you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the things, and I think this is true for Christians and even non-Christians, is, we don't like it when things are really complicated, right? We don't like it when there are, if you've ever tried to build something, right? You open it up and it's a 250-page book, right? Immediately, even without having touched a thing, it can be the best directions in the world, and you're going to say, oh, I don't want to do this, right? It's too complicated. Give me something simpler. And I think for a lot of people, the Christian faith appears that way, right? It's all these rules and all these things you got to think about, and there's so much going on. And at times, it can feel that way, yes, right? There's so many things to keep track of. But in some regard, what Paul writes to us here is the reality of the Christian faith. It's not complicated in a lot of areas. Many times it's quite simple. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? How do you treat someone? Well, you don't have to run through a whole list of 25 different, well, what about this? Well, if they do this, then go down to part B and then read there and go down to section 17. No, it's love your neighbor, right? It simplifies it. He says this is what you owe. You owe to love. And you love one another in this fashion. And by doing that, you're actually doing all of these other things that you might think, okay, today I'm not going to murder, and today I'm not going to steal, and today I'm not going to commit adultery. He says, just say you're going to love, and you're not going to do all of those things. And I think that is a part of the blessing that God has given to us, right? He says you love. And when you love, so many of the other things get taken care of. Go ahead, Brianna.
I think also with the world, so much they focus on what Christians can't do. You can't murder, you can't do this, you can't do that. But like what Paul just saying, we have to focus on loving others. It's not focusing on us not being able to do this or this or that. It's what we can do. And if we view what God tells us to do of just like the positive part of what we get to do, we get to love others like ourselves. We get to treat each other respectfully. We get to worship the Creator every Sunday. If we look at these things that we get to do, it is exactly what He wants us to be with the rules of a loving safety net for us rather than restrictive speed limit, if you will,
sure,
of all the rules. And it's just a perspective that really changes things.
Yeah, I think that connects with what Rudy said earlier about it's good for us. It's a better way to live. If we all did this, life would be better on earth, right? Now again, that's not the only reason that God has us do it. It's because that's His nature, right? It's the very nature of God. It is love. His character, what makes Him up is love. And so it should make sense that we also are a people of love, but it's good for us to do that. And the challenge for us is keeping that perspective on it's a good thing for us to do that, right? Sometimes you might have a situation and it's more like, ugh, all right, I know the loving thing to do, but I don't really feel like doing that, right? That's kind of the attitude that we can have because we're tired or that person has done this or they've done that, right? And we have all of these things where it's a burden instead of a blessing. And it is a mentality that we bring, but it's one that's hard to maintain sometimes. Any other thoughts on chapter 13? Go ahead, Nancy.
For the first time, have never seen this verse before. Now I can't find it. Okay, 13 verse 12. I've never seen that before. It says, the night's nearly over, the day is almost here, so let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. You hear so much about the armor of God and all the different things we have, but the armor of light was the first time I've ever caught that before, and it's like, well, that's so that we can see where we're going. When you put on the armor of light with righteousness and truth and the Word of God, and so I just thought that was cool. I've never caught that before.
Yeah, Ephesians 6 is the one that we tend to only associate with the idea of the armor of God. But here we see the idea of the armor of light. And that whole section, verses 11 down through 14, he really lays out this, we are people of the day. And he's using that as an illustration, right, of there's kind of a cut, right? There's the day and there's the night. There's light and there is darkness, and the things of darkness we're supposed to put aside, right? We want nothing to do with those, and he goes through a little list of those in verse 13. All right, we're done with that stuff. We're going to wear the armor of light. We're going to be a people of light. We're going to walk in step with the Spirit in that regard. And so there is, again, going all the way back to chapter 6, there's a change. We have died to one way of life, and now we're doing something differently. Now the challenge, right, is keeping that darkness away, keeping the things that are supposed to be dead, because they come back, right? They become a challenge for us from time to time. Go ahead, Mike.
I've heard people describe the three major dispensations in this daylight means. Where the patriarchal age, it was the twilight, there were stars, you could see a little, but you couldn't really see much. And in the Mosaic age, the moon is out, and you can see more. And in the Christian age, the sun is out, and you can see. And I think an illustration is there to describe that God is slowly unfolding his ultimate plan for all of us. And now, in this Christian age, we've got the whole plan laid out. And I'm not saying that's exactly what Paul
Sure.
is mentioning here, but there were things in the past that he allowed, like he mentions divorce in the Mosaic law, that now the Christian age, what do we accepted some things now? Here's the real law. We leave behind, and I think it makes more, helps shed light on what he says in the letter. Because he says, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. I think that reflects not that, salvation is coming tomorrow or Jesus is going to come right away, but we're now in that age where it's here and then salvation. There's nothing else coming.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those concepts that's going to pop up over and over again in the New Testament as you read it, right? Which is this now and yet not yet. There's this part of it that's every day is affected, and it could be tomorrow, but it might be 1,000 years from now. But we live knowing that it is happening. It may happen tomorrow, it may happen 1,000 years from now, but it is going to happen, and we are in that final time where nothing else is coming, right? Nothing else is going to be brought about to reveal anything new. It's just the only thing coming is Jesus, right? And so we live in light of that fact. Any other thoughts? All right, let's go to chapter 14. Chapters 14 and 15 all the way through verse 7 kind of connect together. And this is a section that is not complicated to understand on a basic level. And I say that because everyone agrees that opinions shouldn't divide us. Where we disagree is what is an opinion and what isn't an opinion, right? That's the struggle. The struggle isn't, well, should we argue about opinions? Nobody says yes to that. It's what exactly is an opinion? What is, some of your translations might say in verse 1 there, disputable matters. Paul writes in chapter 14, he says, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. For God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. And so, remember, in the context of the book of Romans, right, one of the big issues, and this is, I don't know if it was Wright or who I was reading from brought this up, but, the big issue, right, is the Jew and Gentile situation. How are they going to work through all of this? Because there's, again, imagine either being a Jew or a Gentile to this day. If you're a Gentile, you've come from a pagan background, right? Today, we could say, well, people believe in nothing. That wasn't how it worked back then, I would guess usually at all, right? They believed in something. They believed in some sort of a God or multiple gods. And so you're coming from that background, and now you're worshiping one God with people who worship that one God, but they also have some other crazy stuff that you're like, what in the world? Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you eat this, right? So all of that's going on, and how in the world are they going to get along, right? And so somebody I think I read from used, an illustration, but you imagine, we do potluck. You imagine one of the first times they got together, and it's like, some people probably have never been in the presence of some of that food, thinking, I can't be here, right? I can't be around this stuff. And yet, how do they deal with that, right? How do they handle all of this? And so we see this as well in the book of 1 Corinthians. We talked about that a little bit on Sunday, where Paul deals with it there as well. But you've got Christians who came from a pagan background that, idolatry, and basically what it sounds like is they would have offered up these animals as sacrifices, and then the temple would, you'd eat some there potentially, or they'd sell some in the marketplace. And so for some Christians, it was no big deal because, and as we talked about last week, Paul says, an idol's nothing. It's a statue. There's no connection to any true, there's no other God, right? And so it is nothing, and yet, for some people, there was still too much association. They didn't want to get near it, right? And obviously for the Jewish people along the same lines, right? No, I don't want anything that's been worshipped to some other god. That's unclean. That's not food that we're going to eat. And so how do they deal with this, right? How do they work through this? And Paul basically tells them, don't judge or despise one another, right? Because let's be honest. What's the easiest thing in the world to do when you come across someone who thinks very differently than you? To judge them and despise them, right? To say, well, they're wrong. And not just that they're wrong, because they may in fact be wrong, right? But they're dumb for holding the viewpoint that they hold. Or if they really loved God, they wouldn't think that way, right? I mean, that's one of the very easy things for us to do, is to begin to associate, well, here's what they really believe. Here's what their heart really is. If they really understood things like I do, all of a sudden, right, we go to judging and despising. Again, it's... when we don't have any disagreements, it's really easy to say, well, of course we're not going to fight, right? But even over the silliest things, as soon as someone disagrees with us, we get a little bit irritated, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be church-related things. I mean, if somebody came up today and they started bad-mouthing something I really like, even if it really doesn't matter, I'm probably going to get a little irritated, right? If you said one of my cars, that's the worst car in the world, I might kind of be like, now, hold on a minute. I didn't say anything about your car, right? What are we doing here, right? Even with silly things, we do that kind of stuff. Now, imagine then when you feel really strongly about it because of your faith. All of a sudden, it's a little bit harder to say, I'll just let it go. It's a little harder to say, well, I'll concede to doing something that I really don't want to do, but it's okay because that's what they want me to do. That's a lot harder to do. And that's basically what he says for them to do here. As you go down to verse 13, he says, therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it is unclean for anyone who thinks it is unclean. For if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. And so he takes it from, again, we've brought this up a little bit already, but culturally, right? Culturally, we kind of say, you do you, right? You do whatever is best for you. Don't care what people think. Don't care how it affects someone else. If you want to go off and do this, then you go off and do that, right? Doesn't matter how anybody else is affected by it. And yet here, Paul says, if you have a brother or a sister who is grieved by your actions that you don't have to take, right? You don't have to eat meat with them. If you choose to do that, you're no longer walking in love. You're not showing love to them. And so it's more than just opinions now. It's about love. And we've already seen, right, in the previous chapter there in chapter 12, love's kind of important. So you don't just walk all over that and say, it's no big deal. Love is hugely, hugely important. Any thoughts on chapters 14 or 15 about this whole opinion situation, Sheila?
This is one of my big stumbling blocks. Because I'm a beer drinker. It's Friday, beer time. And all this, you can't be a Christian and drink. Well, yes you can. So, yeah.
So when we talk about difficult, challenging issues, and that's one of them, which you kind of just put way out there for us. That's one of those that we argue about, right? And the truth is, with that discussion in particular, that is one that as soon as we bring that up, everybody's got their verses. Everybody's got their logic, right? Everybody's got their, let me show you these 7 reasons why I think it is or isn't okay, right? I mean, as soon as that topic comes out, right now, some of you might even be thinking those things. I'm going to go talk to Sheila after we get done, and I'm going to tell her these.
In my defense, yes, there are people out there with problems with alcohol, and I would never drink around them. But I have problems with diabetes. I have problems with sugar. Does anybody not bring a dessert on potluck?
And so when we look at these things, right, it's easy until it's not easy, right? It's easy until there is an issue, And sometimes, and to bring up your last point there, sometimes the issue isn't because so-and-so is a jerk. They put as much sugar as they could right in front of my face. It's that they don't even know, right? They don't even know. And so, again, part of the issue isn't always, well, we've all come to I've reached my conclusion and you've reached your conclusion, and now we can't agree because we've hashed it all out. Many times it's because we've not even talked. We've not even had a conversation about whatever the issue is to sort out what is the right way to do it. And sometimes there is a right way, and other times there's maybe a better way, but not necessarily the only way, right? And so, again, there's a lot going on. Londa and then Dave.
Well, I think what it says in verse 19, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. And I think sometimes that's one of the hardest things to do, is to get together and really talk something out and find out what is actually God's will.
Yeah, and going to that point, right? This is the overarching thought with this, right? Is that whatever we choose to do needs to be guided by the principle, right? That we want to do what makes for peace and what builds up. That we're not attempting, and the very end of the book, he talks about division, right? Warn a divisive person, right? That kind of idea. God hates division. And so we want to work out, but if we approach it without that mindset, we're going to have problems all day long. Dave?
Another just overarching view in verse 8. If we live for the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. I told Nancy, that's what I want on my tombstone. So I'll come back and haunt her if you don't do it. And that really is the key. I belong to the Lord. And that is the overarching, intertwining principle that can lead to peace or spiritual war.
Now, what's the big picture, right? And it's not my way or the highway, or I get my way on everything, but it's much, much bigger than that because we are the Lord's, and that affects everything. Go ahead, sir.
So I kind of have a lot to say.
Okay.
I'm trying to say too much.
Okay.
But this conversation, when you brought up eating in the buildings, she brought up alcohol, and some others are really big topics in the churches of Christ.
Sure.
And I personally think the biggest reason is biblical interpretation. I can stand with that, but I think sometimes we narrow too much on looking for a command or permission to do something. Like you guys have probably heard, speak where the Bible speaks.
Sure.
Or be silent where the Bible is silent. You guys all heard that? Well, the problem is that so many people take silence as prohibition. And then when you introduce or prohibition, you are now speaking where the Bible doesn't speak. And so, piggybacking off of that, consider this. In the scriptures, there are some places where the apostle said, go ahead and get circumcised. And then another place he says, don't get circumcised. And then another place he would say, wear head coverings. And another place, that's not a requirement. And examples like that, which tells me that everything is not about a command, but it's about wisdom. And like that lady pointed out in the scripture, which is a recurring theme in the epistles, not just in Romans, but in Corinthians, do what is good for the mutual edification. So let's say you go to a church, and I don't know if you guys eat in the building or not, but let's say you go to a place that does. Well, people want to eat in the building together. Why? Because of fellowship. That's one great way to spend time with people, and you don't have much else in common. But if you're going to go if I move somewhere and they don't eat in the building, I think I'm going to take my time about trying to persuade them about it. I'm not going to divide over the whole thing and say, you guys aren't Christians. You're eating in the building. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11.
Sure.
You completely missed the entire point of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, in my opinion. But just something to consider. I don't know what you guys think, but I think if you're familiar with what lots of church Christ sermons are like, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think the challenge, like you bring up, and it kind of goes back to what we saw in chapter 13 with the idea of, love one another. We like that because it simplifies things, right? You just show love, but then it gets complicated because we want to have, okay, what is love, right? We want to have it explained out to us and have all of these, we want to have 75 different commands on what love is, so then we know that we're loving, and that's not, we like that sometimes. We like having all of the rules laid out, and we don't always have those. Sometimes we do. Sometimes God says, this is what you must do this, and so that's what we do. Other times, there's not as explicit instruction there, and to your point, sometimes silence means something, sometimes it doesn't. We have to look at a lot of things than just one passage on stuff, but it is a challenge, right? And that's where this chapter, these chapters 14 and 15 in particular, that's where we get in a struggle where people approach like the subjects you bring up with different mindsets, and there's no willingness to work through those, to have conversation about those, to try to figure out, okay, how can we in this situation, right, do what leads to peace? What does that look like? Because you bring up an example of it might look different in a certain setting, because this is what is the way that, and again, if we go back to the context here, Paul says, I would guess in some places, if you want to eat meat and everybody's comfortable with that, then eat meat. But if you go somewhere else and they're not comfortable with it, then don't eat it, right? Then choose not to do that to keep peace, to bring good into the congregation there. The challenge for us is none of us have that problem. That would be easy, right? If the issue for us was, are we going to eat meat or not eat meat? That's not usually the issue, and if it is, it's not for that reason that they're talking about. You may not like animal things, and so you say, well, we need to be vegetarians or whatever, but that's not what's happening here. There was no issue with we shouldn't eat meat. It was more the kind of meat that it was. And so, there's so much going on, and too often what happens is we end up getting kind of hung up on maybe our personal view or what we were taught or what our congregation may think as a whole, and we don't have conversation, and that conversation doesn't always have as Londa brought up, verse 19 in mind. What is good? What's going to build up? What's going to bless? Mike and then Gary.
I want to go back to what Dave was saying, how we're all servants, essentially. But in verse 4, he says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? That servant almost brings up this idea of property. We have insufficient fences around my backyard to keep my kids' influence into that little piece of flex. We're throwing stuff over the fence, and in my head, it's okay. Don't go messing up your neighbor's yard. And at least me, I have a hard time applying that same attitude to people.
Sure.
Don't go messing up your farmer's heart.
Right.
We see people as, we're all just free agents bouncing around, but we're not. And sometimes, at least me anyway, put more emphasis on, the sanctity of what people have than the people themselves. It's easier. I think maybe it's easier to say we understand not to mess up other people's property. Other people themselves really matter.
Yeah, and that is a challenge, right? We feel compelled sometimes when we shouldn't have compulsion to do that, right? To get in a place we're not meant to be. They're not responsible to us, which is what he lays out there. Go ahead, Gary.
I like how he ends up with 22 and 23. The faith which you have it your own conviction before God, after the one who does not condemn himself in what is true. And, it puts it back on us. Who should we be looking at? Everybody else? We need to look at ourselves. And we need to figure out our faith and why we have that faith. And not based on what someone else's faith is, not look at someone else and say, well, they don't believe the same thing I do about a certain thing. We stand before God on our own, and we have to have this firm foundation, this faith. And then verse 23 goes on and talks about doubting and being condemned and stuff. So I just think that's important in this conversation to, God put that on us, to put us back in our place, really.
Yeah, it's not just whatever we want to do, right? There's the challenge of reflecting on our own lives and what we're doing, the things that we're dealing with, and that really matters to God, right? It's not spend all of your time looking outward, but really do consider your own life as well. Go ahead, Rudy.
Three things. First, we are humans. We make mistakes, plenty of mistakes.
Right.
Second of all, as I was thinking about this, there's God has given us the guide us towards our daily living. It's a Christian or it's a regular person, you know, we have the Holy Spirit that helps us and guide us. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the Holy Spirit is teaching us as we go along how to behave as Christians. And it's giving us discerning what's good, what's bad, what's wrong, what's going on, you know, what should I do this right, you know, this way. The reason why I say that is because we are judged in our own selves. You cannot judge me or I cannot judge her. I can't judge nobody. Only God can judge me. And so we have to discern what's good and what's bad. And like for instance, I was on Thursday. I go to two meetings. I do the young men's meeting and the supper with Zach. And then, so I realized as I was going to Zach, I take off too early. So I feel like I was putting a hinder on everybody that I have to take off early, and I felt bad. So I discerned that something's not right. Instead of helping the group, I was really being destructive in that situation.
By the way, for a little context, Rudy is leaving our Bible study to go to another Bible study.
So, yeah. So I did.
Sounds sinful to me.
So in my heart, being a Christian and how much I love everyone, I realized that I was not really being edifying. I was actually being destructive to the group. So then that's why I decided, you know what, I just need to stick with one, right? So, you know, I'm happy that God gives us free will, that we are able to choose. And that's the Spirit that helps us to discern what's right and what's bad. And it makes you kind of check in your heart and figure out, hey, am I doing something wrong? Because if I am, then I need to fix it myself. Nobody can fix it for me, only myself. I got myself in this, and I might as well get myself out of it.
Yeah, and again, and this is a great example, Rudy, of, as we go through all of this kind of stuff, we're going to come to different conclusions. There are probably going to be people who would leave one Bible study, go to another, and think, how could you ever have, I would never feel bad. I'm going to another Bible. And they would never even think about the fact that they're leaving. But for you, that is an issue. And that's fine. If for you it is, it is. For somebody else, it's not, and they never thought about it, and you go on. The problem would be is if Rudy starts to judge everybody else who happens to leave early, well, then that's a different issue, right? And so again, there's so many things, right, that go along with this. I want to end with one thought really quickly. It's in chapter 15. He says in the first couple of verses there, we who are strong have an obligation. That's a heavy word, isn't it? An obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up, for Christ did not please himself. And he goes on to quote some scripture there, but you think about, why would I do that? Why would I not do what I want to do when I know it's right and I'm good with it? Because of Jesus. Because Jesus chose, right? Jesus chose not to please himself. So if he chose that for me, can I not choose to not please myself for him, right? And again, there's all kinds of different issues to get into with that. But the mentality that we bring to the conversation must be, what is good for others? What can I do in line, right? I don't want to violate my own conscience, but what can I do to build others up and still be doing what I believe is right? Go ahead, Zach. Right.
At the very least, churches have to have leaders that have a good grasp of these issues, a lot of experience, because that's how we learn. We learn how to deal with some of these things by watching people in action. I think it's really, really helpful.
Now, what we did tonight was foolish might be a good word for it, right? This is not a section that you can cover in 20 minutes, much less 45 minutes, much less multiple sessions of 45 minutes, right? Because there are so many issues that we have to get into with it. But again, much like we've seen with this whole section, right? It's the way we approach it. We got to begin there. If we don't begin with an eye for building each other up and for doing the things that lead to peace, we're never going to get to anywhere in the first place. And as Zach mentioned, we can both think different things, and one of us might be right in what we believe, but wrong in the way we hold to it, right? And we both might be right and we're doing okay, right? But our attitude towards one another is such that what we're doing is actually wrong because of how we're treating each other in that situation. So there's a lot going on. It calls us not to say, well, we're going to just jettison truth so we never stand on anything. No, but it's an understanding that as we go through things, there are challenges, and there's not always easy to see. And sometimes I don't have the full picture, and sometimes I don't know everything, and well, all the time we don't know everything, right? And so we have to be patient and try to work through this together. And so I appreciate the conversation and the comments and everything tonight. We're moving into Luke, so we have stuff we're pretty familiar with this next week, Luke chapters 1 through 6. We'll go ahead and cut the live stream, and we'll do prayers and wrap up. We're running a little behind.